Kurt. Thank you, Ambassador Volker. Thank you to all of you. We are delighted to provide the pre-dinner entertainment. And as Ambassador Volker said, we're hoping for it to be really a stimulating and engaging debate. So we're going to follow the practice that they've instituted at the McCain Institute. And we have opening statements, we have questions, we have time for response, and we have time to integrate, hopefully, many of you from the audience as part of our debate format this evening. So I will give a brief introduction because we've changed course a little bit, which I think will explain some context for the debate and back and forth we'll hear this evening. The original framing of this debate, as you can see, was 18 months of Trump foreign policy. Is it going in the right direction or the wrong track? Now, that might put such an undue burden on our team here that we have adjusted the question slightly. So we are now no longer going to force them to take the proposition of the right track. Instead, we will be debating the Trump foreign policy at 18 months, and is it perhaps better than it looks in some key respects? So take that for what you will. They are determined advocates, so I want you to give them all benefit of the doubt. As you can see, we have a little bit of a Mars, Venus, Europe, America thing going on here with the balance of our panel. But I would say these two sides are, in fact, at least equally matched. We're not planning to vote at the end of the evening, but if we did, that would be good too. Yes. And I'm very grateful to all of them for agreeing to participate in this discussion tonight. I think of it as the elephant in the room conversation at this conference and probably at many, many other conferences these days, both in Europe and the United States. So I'm deeply grateful to our combatants this evening. Without further ado, let me introduce them. We're going to start here, not with Team Trump, but with Team Perhaps It's Better Than It Looks. Team.
Nice going, Randy.
Randy Schoenemann is the president of the Orion Strategies. He's someone well known, of course, to many people here. He was leading the foreign policy and national security team for the McCain campaign in 2008 and has been deeply involved in Republican foreign policy circles for many, many years. We're very grateful, Randy, to you. His teammate here is Daniel Vidit, who is the president of Yorktown Solutions right now, and has served as a national security advisor to numerous presidential campaigns, including those of Senators Ted Cruz, Governor Scott Walker, and was also active in the Romney campaign in 2012. Thank you so much, Daniel. All right, on to Europe and Venus, as it were. Right next to me is the fantastic Meri, who is a professor of Russian and post-Soviet studies at Sciences Po. And she wanted me to point out she has observed what's going on in American politics and in our foreign policy firsthand during the presidential election year and was on leave in Washington for the beginning of the Trump administration as well. And of course, she also has experience inside French government, working with the French government at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense as well. Meri, thank you very much. And her partner, Constanze Selzenmüller, who has been in Washington with us observing the disruption firsthand, as she is the Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution now. She is, of course, a veteran of the German Marshall Fund as well. And we're delighted to have them as team. It's not better than it looks. So with that, we'll start in. What we've agreed upon is that we will have short opening statements by each team, followed by a response to each. And then we will go into questioning. Each team will have 2 minutes to respond to the questions, followed by a response from the other team if they want it. And then we will bring the audience in as well. I think, given the nature of the questioning tonight, it's only fair for Team Better Than It Looks to set the table for us, and they will both be giving part of the opening statement. I believe, Randy, you go first.
Great, thank you, and thank you. It's great to be back at the Meri conference. I would submit to you that the Trump foreign policy is at least better than it sounds. I would also submit to you that the best thing for the Obama foreign policy legacy was the election of Donald Trump, because instead of talking about what we got out of 8 years of Obama, we're talking about tweets and tariffs and disruption. In 18 months, the Trump administration has largely defeated ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They have struck twice at Bashar al-Assad's regime for the use of chemical weapons. Javelins have been provided to Ukraine and Georgia. Sanctions have been tightened on Russia. There is an increased US and NATO presence on the front lines in Eastern Europe, and the very condescendingly named European Reassurance Initiative for those nervous Nellies in Eastern Europe is now rightly called the European Deterrence Initiative. They have continued a commitment to the mission in Afghanistan, and they have brought the North Koreans, at least as of right now, to a bargaining table or a summit table, apparently in Singapore. Each of these are significant accomplishments, are significant improvements from the previous administration's foreign policy.
And I'll add to what Randy has said and state my bottom line that nearly 18 months into Trump's presidency, the fact of the matter is, speaking in concrete terms, that we actually haven't seen any macro-level negative consequences stemming from his foreign policy. He hasn't destroyed the liberal international order, as some have accused him of, and I think we'll hear more of that, some of those arguments on this panel. There's been no Obama-like reset with Russia. Peace in the Middle East is, I would argue, no further, nor is it any closer as a result of President Trump moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. On trade, as of right now at least, the tariffs that we've seen have not been what I would argue consequential tariffs against China or U.S. allies such as the EU and Japan. The attitude towards the WTO coming from the Trump administration has obviously been very hostile, very negative. But the fact of the matter is that this administration is making use of the WTO more than any previous administration. On the positive side, which is seldom acknowledged by most folks, either because of partisanship or because of a understandable, justifiable distaste for the president's behavior and his rhetoric, if you strip away some of that partisanship and that justifiable, understandable distaste for the president's behavior, what you'll objectively find is that there is a positive side to Trump's foreign policy. He is pushing back on Russia in a way that President Obama never did and never would. He's galvanized a real robust response against North Korea. And his is the first U.S. administration that has truly taken seriously the national security dangers of Chinese IP theft and the imbalances in the Chinese economy. So yes, Trump is unconventional. Without a doubt, that's an understatement. He's unconventional, he's unpredictable. I say that as someone who was highly skeptical of all this during the campaign, and I still acknowledge that there is a lot of risk associated with President Trump and this administration. But President Trump and the Trump presidency, this is a reality. And we have a choice right now. We can either embrace that reality and make use of some of the opportunities that it provides, or we can continue to look for ways to reject that reality and lose out on potentially some of the unique opportunities that an unconventional president provides.
Thank you. All right, team, worse than it thinks. Constanza.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to start out, perhaps surprisingly, by agreeing with much that you've said. Certainly with much that Randy just said. Yes, we've had the Syria strikes that Obama never did. We've had tightened sanctions, arms deliveries to Ukraine. I can live with all that. I'm certainly grateful for the enhanced U.S. presence in Eastern Europe and the fact that the U.S. is still in Afghanistan. However, that can only make me happy if I engage in a strictly selective view of the facts on the table. And that's my problem. I just can't. I'm very sorry. And that has nothing to do with the way Trump tweets or speaks or treats people. It has to do with the fact that he is so clearly at variance with his senior advisors, that he is so clearly a bluffer, somebody who threatens force and then walks things back. And he seems to prefer to walk things back, particularly with autocrats, rather than with his traditional allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Europeans, all of whom he has disavowed, insulted, and deserted. He is still, his letter to North Korea, I leave you to judge, to Kim Jong-un, as an astonishingly wistful hand held out to Kim Jong-un. Be nice to me. That's the only thing I want. Similar language with Duterte, with Putin. Does this not endanger the international liberal order? Does this not undermine the West and the normative foundations of our alliance? Of course it does. Thank you.
Yes.
Mari, you have even gotten extra time from your teammate.
Yes. I'm amazed at the way you present a lot of those accomplishments as US accomplishments. If you take, for example, the case of Syria, strikes against Syria, did the US go about it alone? I mean, you never mention once an allied policy. And I think this is the very point that Constance and I feel very uncomfortable about, is this attitude of, I would say, arrogance of a US policy being a national policy first and foremost. In the world of today, when the US has a great system of alliances, how come you just list a number of so-called accomplishments taken out of the general context of security in Europe, security in Latin America or in Asia? So I am a little surprised that you think of US foreign policy just as a list of deals. I would call them deals rather than accomplishment. I would also like to stress the fact that to us Europeans, there is a real problem with the way foreign policy is made in Washington, D.C. When President Trump tweets and a senior advisor or secretary says, don't mind his tweets, we'll do the right thing. It doesn't work. Tweets make policy. They create lots of problems for us. And I'd like just to finish, to take the Putin case. One of you said, oh, but Trump is great because he defies Putin. I mean, this is a joke. This is a joke. I mean, Donald Trump was ready to love Putin and have the best relationship with Putin. He even promised to lift sanctions. Why didn't he do it? You know better, but you didn't mention it. Better. He was trapped in the problem of subversion and meddling in the U.S. election. So what I hope we can do later with Constance is really offer a new approach to what U.S. transatlantic policies should be in today's world.
Okay, opening statements. We now have 2 minutes for each team for rebuttals.
Well, just briefly, I did mention allies, I guess implicitly. I'm happy to make it explicit. Mm-hmm. When you talk about an increased forward presence in Eastern Europe, that's obviously with our partners in Eastern Europe and with our NATO allies. When you talk
it was
about
mostly what you said about Syria, as if the U.S. had.
Okay,
Yeah.
I will get to that.
U.S. in Syria.
In the very short amount of time allotted to me that has just been eaten up a little bit. When you're committed to the mission in Afghanistan, that's obviously with our partners. And on Syria, obviously we welcome the British and French participation. I think if the British and French had wanted to go on their own, I certainly would have applauded that. They didn't in the Obama administration. The red line was laid down. And when you talk about being a bluffer, I can think of no worse bluff in recent international relations and laying down a red line on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. and then doing nothing about it. And that is a criticism that is shared by people ranging from Leon Panetta to Hillary Clinton. Finally, on Russia, let me just briefly say, this wasn't a tweet, and I'm certainly not going to defend the policy, practice, or outcomes of tweeting. Russia bashing must end. That wasn't a tweet. That was someone named Juncker, who's the president, and that was just a couple days ago, who's the president of one of the EU bodies. So I think softness towards Russia is not something that's shared with candidate Trump or early administration President Trump.
I'll just a quick point on, or a couple points on Russia in particular, because I think that is a very important example, and both of you suggested that his Russia policy is not, in fact, his Russia policy, and you're absolutely right that Congress played an incredibly important role early on in adopting sanctions and
Senator McCain.
and codifying the existing sanctions regime, preventing this administration from even thinking about lifting those sanctions. However, at this point, if you look at the substance of the policy and what we have, it is light years ahead of what we had under President Obama in terms of how this administration is approaching the substantive aspect of Russia policy. Now, every so often the president tweets and he says, gee, wouldn't it be nice if I had a great personal relationship with Vladimir Putin? If I have the choice, and I have the choice between the substantive Russia policy that we had under President Obama, but not have a president who's saying he'd like to have a friendly relationship with Putin, and on the other hand, having the sort of policies that we do now, but having a president who every so often says he'd like to see Vladimir Putin, or that he'd like to have a good relationship, I'll take the latter. I will take substance over style.
Okay. All right, we have response.
Okay. It seems to me that on Russia, you're essentially saying ignore the president. Look at what the Department of State and the Pentagon are doing. And I can frankly live with that. At this point, I'll take anything good that I can get.
We're open.
Still, I find it hard to ignore the president because he is the president of the United States, and because we have seen that he is quite happy to disavow his cabinet members openly. That he has told the Secretary of Defense to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria and Afghanistan, that he has publicly contradicted his national security advisor in North Korea. And it seems to me that, in contradiction to both of you, we are already seeing a destabilization both in the Pacific theater and in the Middle East. In the Pacific theater, what we saw after the first withdrawal from the North Korea summit, we saw the president of South Korea immediately meeting with his North Korean counterpart. How that doesn't weaken American allies in the theater and strengthen the hand of China and North Korea, I don't know. And what we're looking at in North Korea is still an incredibly tenuous outline of a deal. And I don't need to tell you that usually the concession Americans make at the end of such processes is a meeting with the president, not right at the beginning, and certainly not with a North Korean counterpart who's under sanctions. Similarly, tariffs. You're forcing Europe to do something that they don't want to do, which is to join America in destroying the international liberal trade order. Meanwhile, you're making exceptions for China, supposedly your most important adversaries in the trade arena, and you need us at your side if you want to deal with the very real menace that China presents in this field. And we haven't even mentioned the Iran deal yet. The Iran deal, an achievement, a genuine achievement of transatlantic diplomacy. Its weaknesses were acknowledged by us all. The Europeans tried incredibly hard to provide a genuine fix, and were rebuffed publicly and humiliatingly. How that advances the cause of order, I do not know. You'll have to tell me.
Meri.
Yes. And I will build exactly on this. You remember, just very recently, Emmanuel Macron's visit to St. Petersburg to the Economic Forum. I think it is interesting to try and understand the new French policies, because France has been sort of dismissed as non-existent in Washington for a number of years.
Doing a lot better than the Germans. I can tell you that.
So it was really extremely interesting to follow Macron's first steps. He goes to Washington, D.C., embraces Trump. Probably overdid it a bit. I would agree with this. You know, I mean, he's new, he's young. I don't think he understands as well as we all do that no one can influence Donald Trump. But anyway, at least he tried. He goes home. The Iran deal is called off by the White House. And then Macron decides to confirm his trip to St. Petersburg, which was sort of up in the air. Originally, he was even supposed to go to Moscow first before Peter, because of the Skripal case, because of chemical attacks in Syria, because of a number of other issues. So he goes, and then he overdoes it with Putin. And one of the reasons is that he was profoundly destabilized by Donald Trump's decision on the Iran deal, which, of course, puts us Europeans in an insecure position, and I mean insecure in terms of security of our countries and our peoples.
Thank you, Meri.
Because we are now sort of stuck between an unpredictable Putin policy, or rather, we know it better probably than we know Trump's policy, and an American policy that on those issues we don't see as the policy of an ally.
All right. I think Team Worse Than It Looks has raised an important point that will be my first question to you both, which is, why is it that trade and tariffs did not come up in this argument? How does the president's America First agenda of economic nationalism fit into the foreign policy views that you've both outlined?
Well, when you said at the outset, you're not going to call me a Trump person, that's kind of an understatement, since I did sign some letters that said he was unfit to be president. And one of the concerns was...
Everyone here, by the way, admires very much that you are making the case here. So we stipulate to that.
One of the concerns was specifically trade policy. And I think if you look at trade policy, first of all, the administration is deeply, deeply internally divided over this. Second of all, President Trump is not one, shall we say, that is heavily engaged in an interagency process. He's much more attracted to things that he can do unilaterally, be they pardons or be they tariffs. And I think that's why he went for them. But the idea that we would engage in economic measures that end up, as Constanza said, giving China a pass and calling Canadian steel and German aluminum a national security threat is absurd. And I will, on this, quote Republican Senator Ben Sasse, who said, making America, just yesterday I believe, making America great again doesn't mean making America 1929 again.
Do you want to come sit over here?
Only on trade, so far.
Daniel, do you agree with your teammate, or?
I agree that I also signed those letters at the time. So why don't we just
Okay.
also put that on the table? But one fact check here: China's not gotten an exemption on steel and aluminum. The EU has not gotten an exemption either. But to say that we're treating that the United States is treating the Chinese better on trade issues than the EU is just nonsense. There's a Section 301 IP investigation. There are proposed $50 billion worth of tariffs on the table, potentially another 100. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that is that those are different figures than what we're talking about with respect to the EU and EU trade. So that's one. Secondly, I don't want to justify his trade policy, other than to say, and this isn't a justification. This is just merely an effort to point out empirical evidence. Not much has actually been done. Okay, the steel and aluminum tariffs, they are a tiny, tiny fraction of transatlantic trade. What I can say is I think that the approach of this administration is to leverage that to actually create a broader trade discussion with the EU, where we might actually get something in the end maybe akin to a mini TTIP. That's the hope. That's aspirational. I'm not quite sure that we'll get there, but there is a certain rationale and logic. And again, I'm not saying that this is the approach that if I were in the administration, I would be advocating. But ultimately, I do think we need to keep an open mind on a lot of these issues and bear in mind where we are specifically. What has been done thus far? Where are we? And sure, there's a potential to do a lot more. And in some areas, things are unfortunately trending in that direction. But as of right now, we need to think of these things as tactical moves by this administration that may ultimately result in something positive down the road.
Constanza, Randy opened, I think, with a very important and provocative point, which is perhaps President Obama is the biggest beneficiary of the Trump administration foreign policy. And more broadly, the rise of an outsider like President Trump, or here in Europe, there are numerous examples, really beg the question of what are the successes of this world order that you're so eager to tout? And isn't the rise of this kind of disruptive outsider politician evidence that the traditional foreign policy consensus from Brussels or even from Washington has failed?
Okay, I do have to respond just in one sentence to what Dan Vidic just said, which is that, if that's your theory of trade or your description of how this administration's theory of trade works, that's like proposing to a woman by slapping her around a little bit to soften her up for the proposal. I mean, that speaking here from the Venus side of the stage, I think that's not going to go so well. But,
All right.
forgive me, I know that was a cheap shot, but I couldn't resist. Now, on to the international order part. Look, I think there's actually a great deal to be said that there's two, I think, strands to this argument. One is you can, I think, say with some justification that the Trump administration is continuing a sort of strand of retreat from the international order, an urging other countries to take a stronger role that both George Bush and President Obama pursued. In that sense, there is some continuity, and I admit that. The important difference to me, it seems, that there is a completely different framing, which is a move in this national security strategy, and even more pronouncedly in the national defense strategy, from an order that is based on an ideal of cooperation to an order that not only acknowledges competition and competition with great powers, but embraces it, to quote those papers. And that adopts a particularly transactional approach to allies. And if you combine that then with the embrace of autocratic illiberal leaders by this particular president, I think that has the effect of putting the order that we have, and that had its flaws and its failures, absolutely, and we could wax at length on that, on a very slippery slope.
Murray.
Yes. Well, clearly, the President of the United States has, nailed the coffin of the world liberal order, which to me, and I think to most Europeans, especially French, is not a problem, because for us in France, it was a myth. I don't think you've ever had a conference in France about the international liberal order. It was something that was very Anglo-Saxon. But I think it's important, because for years, and also under Obama, I think the way Europeans think, we're 500 million people, and we have a very important neighborhood, east and south, the Mediterranean. So I think the way we think as a community, as a continent, our perceptions of security, of the future, of the role of the UN, of the role of NATO, I think it is very important that in the US now, you listen to us, because I think that was one of Obama's mistake, is not to really enter a dialogue with the Europeans. And I think the good thing about harebrained Trump is that you all here, you can do this. I mean, you have to prepare for, the post-Trump America and the post-Trump ally with the Europeans. It's also, please try to think about Europe not as a weak, dysfunctional organization or community. It is not. It's a very, very different organization than maybe other multilateral organizations. But we have to go back to this, of Europe having its own policies and needing America as a partner in advancing those policies. So basically, I mean, I think what you continue to do is present the US policy as a very national interest kind of policy. I don't think you can afford this anymore.
Okay, thank you. Neither one of you has made the case on the Iran deal and the strategic goals of the United States that were served by withdrawing from it.
So let me just address the Iran deal. And thank you for asking, since I didn't get a chance to rebuttal. For anybody in this room or anybody on this continent that was surprised by President Trump's decision, you must not have been paying attention, because the only thing that surprised me was that it took as long as it did. Any Republican president, and all of them, virtually all of them, pledged on the campaign trail to do away with the deal in greater or lesser form. I think all that the Obama-led negotiations with our European partners demonstrated is that it's always possible to get a deal if you give enough away. In fact, at a late stage in those negotiations, the French almost walked away, because every promise the Obama administration made to Congress, to the Americans, and to the Europeans, anytime, anywhere inspections, no enrichment, full accounting for past history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was done away with in that deal. And so I think it certainly could have and should have been handled much better in terms of how they got out, and how we could have, I think, mobilized the Europeans more to address some of the concerns that weren't addressed in the deal, Iran's regional behavior, ballistic missile program, et cetera. At the end of the day, no one should be surprised. In fact, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, got a lot of heat for sending a letter signed by I believe almost every Senate Republican to the Ayatollahs, pointing out that they chose to negotiate this as an executive agreement, and that the next president could walk away from it. Maybe he should have CC'd the EU on that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we read it.
Well, first of all, let me agree with Constanza regarding her spousal abuse analogy. Again, this is not a trade policy that I would pursue, and it is analogous to that. But on the Iran deal, I would say, look, you can make various arguments about the Iran deal in the short term in terms of whether it was good or bad. But over the long term, I would argue that this was inherently a flawed deal. And all that President Trump has done through his withdrawal from the deal has forced a conversation right now that any U.S. administration, Republican or Democrat, would be having with the EU, with the Europeans, and with our other allies in a few years' time, once the sunset provisions expired. So we're having that conversation now. We're dealing with this problem now, rather than dealing with it in 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And again, any U.S. administration, Republican or Democrat, Trump or unlike Trump, would be having this conversation.
All right. So I want to turn back to you both. You've raised serious questions about the decisions made by President Trump, and especially when it comes to the impact on alliances, the Iran deal, trade. At the heart of a lot of what President Trump offers is a diagnosis of European weakness. And my question to you both is, how has Europe's response not proven President Trump's theory? What inherently are you going to do about decisions like the tariffs and the Iran nuclear deal?
I'd like maybe first to, maybe not directly respond to what we should do, but I think the view of Europe as being weak is a constructed vision for Donald Trump's White House to continue on its path of isolation. And I really think the big word here is isolation, or if you want, aggressive retrenchment. And this is absolutely key. So you need to dismiss the other, the European, if you think in terms of protecting yourself, isolating your country, of going for America first in terms of the economy. And this is where the Europeans cannot agree with this. We cannot agree for the US to be an isolated big power that can easily resort to force, because again, aggressive retrenchment, not peaceful retrenchment. I mean, basically, Donald Trump, as a person, is at war, or let's say at confrontation with almost everyone. Even Canada, Mexico, I mean, it's not just... So we have to deal with this problem of constant confrontation, talking about war all the time, the way Americans confront us, and I think there is something feminine and masculine about it, is that there's something bullying about saying, we can do our own things, and you, Europe, you're weak, you're not a big military power, although we do have nuclear and military powers inside Europe. Brexit is out, but is not out of NATO. So I think the idea that Europe is weak is only helping this narrative. It's not serious. And to make it very clear, since we are in the masculine-feminine, I see the American polity today as midlife crisis man, turning it back, not only on his wife, but his children, his friends, his family, his mother, everybody. Europe is the key family. When you think about security in the world, when you think about prosperity, about values, about culture. So the problem is not only Trump. I see American society, American institutions, American corporate world also going through a midlife crisis. What are you going to do about it?
Okay. I have the feeling this sort of relational metaphor could go swiftly downhill, but
it's fun. It's
but
fun.
Yes, it is a lot of fun, and I need to admit, because I think that there are some people in the room who heard me say this, that at a recent Brookings Roundtable on this very subject, I said that it seemed to me that we were moving into a sort of the Handmaid's Tale version of transatlantic relations, that was, for me as a woman, that was of some concern, yes. That said, I think we shouldn't indulge ourselves here too much, because Susan points, I think, at an absolutely legitimate point, which is that the European response to this phenomenon has been disjointed, incoherent, and weak, and that we need to do better. And that my argument, unlike Meri, where I disagree with you, and it is, although I believe that you and I are both committed transatlanticists, is that while Trump is not just a singular phenomenon, he's not just a blip on the screen, he is a symptom of a larger malaise. There are also many, many people in Washington and beyond the Beltway who believe otherwise, and who are interested in the decent opinion of mankind, and who don't think of alliances as entanglements, and who want to remain in a positive state of relations with the rest of the world. And the question for us, I think, and so far in the last 18 months, I think that we as Europeans have done really quite badly at this. How we manage living with the Trump phenomenon that is not just Trump, how we resist where we have to resist, how we engage where we can engage, and how we otherwise remain in contact with the rational elements of US foreign and security policy, and with the many, many ties that bind us to the actors of the American economy, to American society, where, if anything, the ties are deeper than ever before.
Yeah.
That is what is so suicidal about this trade policy, is that it harms America. It doesn't make America great. That's what's so tragic about it. Meri, don't come on, let's be fair.
Okay.
Let's stick with the rules.
Okay. I want to get...
Constanza, you're welcome to come to this side.
No, I can walk myself back. Don't worry.
I want to turn back to some of the specific issues, especially Russia. But I actually would like both of you to respond to the notion of America as a bullying and out of control midlife man.
So I'm not going to get involved in gender psychoanalysis, but I'm happy to continue the discussion on foreign policy. If I'm not mistaken,
Be that way.
the only uses of force the Trump administration has done is with our British and French allies in Syria, continued the commitment with our NATO and other partners in Afghanistan, continued working with our many partners in ISIS and all supported operations in places like the Sahel. Doesn't sound like America unbound bullying to me. And very quickly on Trump advisors and Trump's view of the world and his view of Europe as weak. I mean, Secretary of State Pompeo, within hours of being confirmed by the Senate, got on a plane and flew to Brussels. I think that should send a pretty powerful signal. Bannon, fortunately, is no longer there. Flynn, fortunately, is gone and pled guilty. The people around President Trump, like Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo that I mentioned, are part of the American system. Yes, the president's on top of the American system, but it is an American system, and that's without even getting into Congress.
Well, I would just say again that this notion that the United States is engaging in isolation or aggressive, extensive retrenchment, I think is wrong. Unfortunately, I do think that there's the possibility for that down the road, without a doubt. However, at this point, I mean, whether we're talking about NATO and the president meeting with the Secretary General, whether we're talking about the WTO, and again, despite the hostile rhetoric, this administration is leveraging that multilateral body more so than any previous U.S. administration. Whether we're talking about the fact that he's no longer questioning the way he did during the campaign, the presence of U.S. troops and U.S. extended deterrence in Asia, I just don't think that you have the evidence yet to say that this administration, this president is isolated, or that, well, he himself may be isolated, but that he has isolated our country, or that he has isolated the United States in a way that amounts to aggressive retrenchment.
Okay, so I think this team has raised an important point. In Washington, it is known these days as TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. Is it possible that some of your arguments are colored by a personal and as well as policy distaste for the president, such that it has colored your analytical view of where American policy is really at as opposed to where it threatens to go? And I'll give you a specific example. When President Obama chided our European allies for, in his view, insufficient commitment to spending a sufficiently large portion of their defense budgets on common defense, it was not seen as an example of American bullying or hectoring. President Trump has arguably taken the same argument, and by making it in a different way, and so vociferously, achieved better results on the same policy end that President Obama had. So are you falling victim to Trump derangement syndrome?
You prefer that I start on this?
Either way.
Yeah. You see, the problem is that I think the distaste towards Trump, the very strong emotions about Trump, they are to be found in Washington, D.C. and in the U.S. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post every single morning. And so I have an idea, at least what's, what the atmosphere on the East Coast, and I guess it's probably even worse in California. So the question should be first asked to the policymakers, CEOs, congressmen in the United States. How do you muddle through when you have such a great distaste for the man, his personality, his way of being with with friends and foes alike. So this question really, Susan, I think is more for Americans themselves, as they have to deal with a president that they cannot say is not legitimate because of this complex electoral system in the US. And this is why I insisted that I saw the American society and some American institutions in crisis rather than Trump himself. Now, Obama, I'm glad you asked the question. What strikes me is how much American colleagues still have to go back to the Obama period to try and make a positive point about Trump. I think it shows that you lack other strong arguments, because of course one can be very critical of Obama's policies. For example, the episode of the 30th of August 2013, walking out of the strikes, the targeted strikes against Bashar al-Assad. But I don't think you're going to go very far by building your case on a critique of the Obama administration. This is what I would say.
Okay.
All right. Trump derangement syndrome. I think if we're all honest, we're all suffering from it.
Yeah.
I think we need to recognize that this is a unique time, and that Trump uniquely challenges our sanity. I would be lying if I didn't admit that, okay? And I think it gets to a point where one sort of just stops reading his Twitter feed. That happened with me quite a while ago. I sort of take it and, on board in passing, sigh and go on. But I do think that you do us an injustice if you think that we don't watch the development of policy very closely. I think we do, and I think there's a great deal to be worried about. And I think we could go into in immense detail, both in the Pacific theater, in the Middle East, the policy towards Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the embassy move to Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. I think we shouldn't go too much into the granular stuff. I want to come back, revert to the Europeans, and say we need to acknowledge that it is entirely right to ask us to bear a greater share of the burden. We haven't been doing that. And it is true that Trump's disruptive and belligerent style has made us sit up, take notice, and do stuff. We'll leave apart his complaints about us not having paid the dues and having to pay back for decades of unpaid country club dues. Yeah? In substance, his complaint was accurate. And if we're also honest with each other, and I think we have to be that here as Europeans, and I think all of us in this room are deeply worried about this, we are seeing the potential disintegration of the European project at our feet. Yeah? That is where we are. It is the most at risk that any of us have ever seen it in our lifetime. And that includes the global financial crisis, that includes the migrant crisis, that includes Russian aggression, Chinese interference, and so on. All of this has put the creation of our parents and grandparents at risk in a way that we thought was inconceivable, and that to us is unbearable. I don't want to live in the world that I'm imagining right now. And we are, all of us, I think, collectively failing to find a way in which we can prevent this. I think we can think of individual policy fixes, but the kind of pan-European leadership that would be necessary to stop these path dependencies that we seem to be sliding into, of tribalism, of selfishness, of indifference. And I am perfectly happy to blame my country for much of that. In the refugee crisis and in the management of the Eurozone crisis, there are many things were made by Germany and are still being made by it. Yeah? Okay. But if we don't find, again, to a sense of solidarity with each other, recognizing that for all this we are going to need the Americans, then I think we are well and truly screwed, and it'll be our own fault, regardless of what Trump has done or not done.
Yeah. Okay. I want to bring in the audience very soon for questions, but I'm going to go back to... All right. I think you're applauding for Costanza.
Somebody had to say it.
I have one more question for this team, and then we'll take the questions. We haven't really come back to Russia in depth. Both of you made the case in different ways in your opening arguments that the Trump-Russia policy was stronger than that of President Obama, and yet I found that there were very few specifics cited. There are sanctions in place. There are new sanctions in place. President Obama put the initial sanctions in place along with European partners. You also mentioned, Randy, the javelins and the arms supplied to Ukraine. But beyond that, my question to both of you is, define for us what this policy actually consists of beyond sanctions, which were imposed at the will of Congress, and because the president did not wish to impose further sanctions, and the provision of limited arms that, as far as I can tell, have not changed or do not have the prospect of significantly changing the military equation in the Donbass.
Well, I'll be real brief and turn to Dan because it's one of his many areas of expertise. But, you know, on sanctions, and I know Meri thinks we shouldn't talk about the Obama administration at all, but if you read Derek Chalet's book, The Long Game, Derek Chalet was a senior official in a variety of capacities in the Obama administration, spends about 400 pages saying, well, at least we didn't do the Iraq War. In justifying and trying to defend a whole range of Obama policies. I am going on sanctions, though, and I don't know if Vlad Kara-Murza is in the room or not, but he will remember this. When we passed the Magnitsky Act with huge bipartisan support, it's the only time, to my knowledge, that the Obama Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, personally lobbied first to try to stop it, and when he couldn't stop it, tried to gut it. I guess as part of the reset. So it's not like the Obama administration was even leading from behind on sanctions. On policy, let me just say Kurt Volker is here, obviously, so that is a component of this, a diplomatic track on Ukraine that is very important. And I also mentioned the enhanced presence in Eastern Europe, which is part of a Russia policy. That is countering the possibility of overt Russian aggression and making sure that Article 5 has a more realistic chance of deterring Russian behavior that it did in Georgia in 2008 or in Ukraine today.
Dan?
Well, look, yeah, I'll just echo, before I get to Russia, echo what Randy said about you know, the Obama administration going back to the Bush administration as kind of its reference point. And that wasn't even unique to the Obama administration.
No.
That is a long-running American political tradition to blame the previous administration. I remember sitting on the stage a few years ago, this was year 7, 8 of the Obama administration, and we were still focusing on the mistakes of the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And those were the essence of, that was the essence of the argument that folks on the Obama side were making about U.S. policy. So yes, you know, it is a time-honored American political tradition, and it's something that we continue to engage in. Just regarding the midlife crisis that we talked about, I do think that the United States is undergoing a midlife crisis in a lot of ways, politically speaking. I would also say that the same is true for Europe, without a doubt, and Constanza, you talked about that. That's something that we both need to acknowledge, because it's this confluence of simultaneous midlife crises that causes and has stimulated this collective crisis of the West. And again, it starts with an honest justification, or rather an acknowledgement of that, so we can work together to collectively address that. On Russia, you know, in addition to what Randy said and what you also pointed out, Susan, which again is lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, is additional sanctions. I would also point out that we've, and when I say we, the United States, the Trump administration has acknowledged Russian cyber attacks, the NotPetya virus against Ukraine, very assertively. Yes, there were congressional sanctions that were mandatory, and thankfully Congress did that to make sure that there was no way that this administration could unwind some of the existing sanctions. But there are also sanctions that this administration has pursued voluntarily that were not statutorily mandated. The Magnitsky sanctions, you know, expanding that list, they, technically speaking, did not have to do that. Other sanctions associated with Russian officials who are undermining Ukrainian sovereignty and stability, that list has been expanded. And as the Russians themselves will say, and we can debate whether this is a good thing or not, but the Russians will tell you that there's essentially no level of communication between the Russian government and this administration. It is hard to think about and think of a quote-unquote tougher approach to Russia than what we currently have, despite, again, what I would refer to style and what I would refer to as this president potentially playing some sort of game with Vladimir Putin where he indicates to him and he dangles out this possibility of better relations. On the substantive front, we've seen a very, very robust approach under this administration.
Okay, audience. Already so many hands. I will do my very best to get. Jamie Kirchig there has the most aggressive hand raising, so I'm going to go to him. He's in the back there. Please, when you're asking questions, tell us who you are, and please do make it a question so we can get as many people as possible.
It's not working.
Jamie Kirchig from Brookings. I would add to Dan's list also killing several hundred Russian mercenaries in Syria, which is several hundred more Russians than I think were ever killed by the United States at any point during the Cold War. My question's about Iran, and isn't there something a little myopic about Europeans complaining about feeling left out by President Trump's decision on the Iran deal when all of America's allies in the actual region of the Middle East who are really bearing the brunt of Iranian aggression and hegemony, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, you name it, are thrilled with this choice? And furthermore, isn't it not also the case that President Obama really reversed a long tradition in American foreign policy of not recognizing or legitimizing the Iranian regime? And that, as Dan said, any president, probably even a Democrat, might not have even achieved this deal. And that really, Barack Obama was a radical departure in terms of his view of Iran and wanting to reset America's relationship with Iran at the expense of our allies in the Middle East, in the same way that he tried to reset America's relationship with Russia at the expense of our allies in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you. You have 2 minutes to respond. Team
Shall we
Europe.
take several questions, maybe?
No, let's go
No,
ahead
you-
with
okay.
each question.
Go ahead. You want to go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah, on Iran.
All right. On the Russian mercenaries, Jamie, I don't really have a problem with that. I have a much bigger problem, or let me add one additional sentence. I deeply regretted that President Obama and the Brits and the French never struck against Syria when Assad first employed chemical weapons. That said, I think we have to acknowledge that these very precise, very limited strikes, if they've achieved one thing, it was to cement the position of Assad and Russia in Syria.
Yeah.
That, I think, is an outcome that I think, should be somewhat careful in evaluating whether that really redounds to our benefit. As for the US allies in the Middle East being thrilled with the ending of the JCPOA, look, none of us here, I think, are going to defend the JCPOA as the perfect agreement, but it, I think, was acknowledged by a swath of American policymakers, and not just by the president, and by European leaders, as helping to stabilize a highly unstable situation, allowing for a degree of verification of Iranian nuclear installations that had never existed, had never been available before, and that indeed left other questions unaddressed, but that we were all aware of and trying to work together to contain. Yeah? And that, as far as most Europeans are concerned, is still better than what we have now, which is a state of affairs where tangibly violence in the Middle East is spiking, where I would say the situation of Israel has become notably less secure, where there is a real possibility of violent regime change in Iran, and my God, I am not fond of the mullahs. But the question is, to me, what happens if the regime in Iran tanks to the rest of the region? I am not endorsing any of these rulers, yeah? But I ask myself, what will we do if violence in Syria, in Iran, in Palestine, in Gaza erupts, if there are new outflows of refugees, and new outflows of refugees to Europe? We have a renewal, maybe an even worse version of the migration crisis of 2015. I don't even want to know what that does to domestic policy in this continent. And I would like to know how you are going to help us deal with it.
Okay. Do you have a response on there, Rand?
I mean, I'm happy to go
Okay.
to the
Let's
next question.
We'll take, okay. Anders. Yeah, it's good.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. To Randy and Dan, you have defended very well, but it's essentially decisions made by others than by Trump himself. So I wonder, can you give any example of a democratic leader who has had any use of seeing Trump at all? We can see that non-democratic leaders...
Any what use?
Any leader of a democratic country that has benefited in any way from seeing Trump isn't the conclusion that it's useless to see him if you are not a dictator from a nice country with Trump towers or other benefits for the Trump family.
Well, Anders, I think President Moon in South Korea, and Constanza's right. I mean, after the letter went out, he had to run for another meeting. But I think President Moon in South Korea, at every public event when he's spoken about the diplomatic track with North Korea, has given President Trump great credit. Likewise, Prime Minister Abe, although on the receiving end of both the cancellation of TPP, something which Hillary Clinton also promised to do, by the way, cancellation of TPP as well as tariffs, still maintains a close personal relationship with President. Democratic leaders, you could go through Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, that has a close personal relationship. And I'm probably missing some, but those are three that occur to me off the top of my head.
Do you have anything?
So what I'll say, Anders, is that you know, this is a bit of a counterfactual. It is a counterfactual, but we don't know what U.S. policy would look like had some of those leaders not met with Trump. So it's, you know, it's difficult to make either argument. But we do know that there's a disparity between what he said on the campaign trail and what he's actually done. As bad as what some of these policies are, and I think we can all agree on, whether it's trade or a few others, not necessarily the Iran deal, but maybe others, you know, we just don't know, right, what the inverse would have been in this counterfactual of him not meeting with these folks. But there is a noticeable divergence, I think, between what he said on the campaign trail and what we've seen. Again, these are fundamental things, but we have not abandoned NATO. We have not abandoned the WTO, thankfully. And that is the fact. I just want to go back to the Iran deal for a second. So I would just say that, you know, Costanza, you're right. I mean, a broad swath of policymakers and even elected Republican officials, I don't want to say embraced, but accepted the JCPOA after the fact and said, okay, rather than withdraw from this deal, the best thing to do is just to kind of try and enforce it at least for a few years, and then we'll see what happens down the road. But that was only after the JCPOA was signed. And so the JCPOA became a reality because President Obama, as Randy indicated, was absolutely committed to cutting a deal, any sort of deal, and we got the JCPOA. What Trump has done is he's created a new reality, for better or for worse. And so I think a lot of the folks who otherwise were saying, let's, you know, as long as the JCPOA is on the books, let's support that document, let's support that agreement. But now I think you're going to see a lot of those folks, again, especially on the Republican side, supporting this move. And you're going to see the dynamics change among the policy community. As far as regime change in Tehran, I think we in the West and the Iranian people should be so lucky. And I know that you're not suggesting that this would necessarily be a good thing and that there are risks involved. I understand those arguments, but we can't be so cautious. If the Iranian people want change, and I fundamentally believe that such a young population that does want to look to becoming integrated with the global society, that if they want change, they will stimulate change on their own. And perhaps we'll have an opportunity to help them stimulate that change. We should take that opportunity.
Okay, I want to make sure we get a few more questions right here in the middle.
Thank you. Ulrike Franke from the European Council on Foreign Relations, London office. I have a question to the US team, and it's a Germany question. So the other day I heard an interesting analysis of US trade policies, and that of course was in the context of the tariffs. And so this analyst said, US trade policies these days appear to have a common theme. They tend to favor the Chinese, leave the Russians largely unaffected, and hurt the Europeans, and in particular the Germans. Now, this was a US analyst, mind you, but this, of course, very much resonated in Europe and in Berlin particularly, because Berlin was very worried before Trump's inauguration, and many of these worries have proven true. So in your view, as a German, should I be particularly worried?
The first thing I'd say is we have so little trade with Russia that any trade policy is going to leave Russia unaffected. As I thought I indicated before, I'm not going to sit on the stage and defend Trump's trade policy. I will say, and I'm by far not a trade expert, that one of the things that is perplexing to me is usually when we run massive trade deficits with countries, it's countries that have cheaper labor or cheaper access to raw materials, and it's the Chinas of the world, it's Japan in a previous time. I don't know exactly what it is with Germany, but should you be worried about where U.S. trade policy is going as a German? Yes. Yes, you should. I certainly am about where it's going, and if you were a Canadian, I'd say the same thing, or any other member, the Japanese that is facing these tariffs under our law, which have, because of the peculiarities of our law, there has to be a finding that it's a national security threat to use this tool. I don't personally believe that President Trump thinks it's a national security threat, but he has to find that determination under our law, and that has hugely negative consequences for our relationships with treaty allies that are now officially termed a national security threat.
I want to push back, continue to push back on this notion that that China is getting some sort of exemption or is getting taken off the hook here. No, I mean, this administration is going after China. I will make the argument again, as I did initially, that not much has happened yet. Just as a matter of fact, there have been a lot of different processes initiated. The most significant of which is going on right now. It's called Section 301, exploring Chinese IP theft. The administration has proposed $50 billion in tariffs. This process is ongoing. At the end of the month, they're going to determine which tariffs and which products they're going to target. And then they actually have to make that decision to target those products. But that in addition to proposed investment restrictions, so barring the Chinese from investing in entire sectors of the U.S. economy, okay, that is just absolutely different, totally different from some steel and aluminum tariffs against the EU. Obviously, we're also thinking about, and they're also talking about auto tariffs. That would be different, without a doubt, but that process has just been initiated. So I definitely want to push back against this notion that the Chinese are kind of getting off the hook here. As Randy said, the Russian economy is a basket case right now. There's no doubt about that, and our relationship, our trade relationship, even before sanctions, was pretty minimal. So that's why the Russians aren't getting hit. Should Germany be worried? Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's not just Germany. We also in the United States should be worried about this administration's approach to trade, and specifically to how it approaches the imbalance with Germany, as well as other allies. But I will emphasize this, that this president's approach to trade is absolutely ideological. He has an ideological determination to reduce the American trade deficit with countries like China, like Germany. And my recommendation to you, and I know we'll also have some broader recommendations at the end of this process, but my recommendation to Germany and to others.
Stop making cars?
Sorry?
Stop making cars?
Stop making cars, right. Everyone buy a Ford, please. Is that, look, if you can, and the South Koreans have done this very well. Thinking about the countries that have succeeded in terms of their personal engagement with Trump, or on the policy front in terms of their trade negotiations and policies. The U.S. South Korea Free Trade Agreement was negotiated. Trump has described it as a huge, huge victory for the United States. It is not. These are minor modifications, but the administration, the president, is calling it a win. And perhaps it will continue an existing trend that's currently taking place in terms of the U.S.-South Korea trade relationship, or bilateral deficit decreasing. So I would urge those countries to understand that and to think about how to, in a creative way, provide the president with the sort of victory that he's looking for, substantively or not. But that is something that we collectively, I think, need to think about in terms of those of us who want to see these trade relationships preserved.
All right, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask both questions and answers to be as brief as possible so we can get as many as possible. Over there, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. I just have a quick intervention. You wouldn't know this because you're on the panel, but almost 30 minutes ago, Donald Trump just tweeted, and I'm sorry, very surprised, because simultaneously at Shangri-La Dialogue, Secretary of Defense Mattis made a statement accusing China of coercion in the South China Sea. Donald Trump tweeted, very surprised that China would be doing this, ? So we're talking about foreign policy, and he's completely undermining.
Thank you. He's doing it on purpose.
All right, Team Europe has just scored a point without even doing anything.
How we always do it.
All right, I'm gonna move on from that. Right.
By the way, that's the South China Sea dispute that he offered to mediate to the Philippine president.
By the way, my most retweeted tweet that I ever made was a tweet in which I said, "Overheard in my kitchen." The phrase I hate the most of the new era is "in a series of early morning tweets."
Thanks for a very entertaining panel, Senator from ICDS. Short comment. You don't need to be American Republican to be able to be critical about Obama administration's foreign policy. I'll give you two examples. Reset, 7 months after Russia attacked Georgia, and walking away from red lines. Article 5 of NATO is a red line. Extremely dangerous for a country like Estonia. But my question goes to American team. Donald Trump is not known for consistency, right? But I would say there are 3 things where he has been consistent. And I understand in a way 2, but I do not understand the third one. I think the 3 consistent themes have been the trade, kind of by a zero-sum game, kind of nationalistic trade. There is a constituency for that. It's popular among some. Second consistent theme is he does not like immigrants, if they are not coming from Norway. And again, there is a constituency for that. I can understand there is a political logic. Third one, say nothing bad about Russia and Putin. There is no constituency for that. Could you explain that third one, please?
So you're asking me to be a Trump-Versteher, which is a difficult position. I'm going to answer that by saying that there's all kinds of theories about that, about compromise and collusion and secret deals and all of that, much of which has been alleged, none of which has been demonstrated. One explanation was suggested to me by a very smart colleague who happens to be in the room, was that it's very simple. That as Constanza mentioned with his letter to North Korea, he needs to be respected. That Trump called him brilliant, although I'm told that the word that he used in Russian can be translated also as very bright, like a light bulb, not just brilliant as in very smart and capable. But that Trump called him brilliant, and that praise means a lot.
Right.
And that may be an explanation. That's the best I can do as a Trump-Versteher.
It's true, but he interpreted it as brilliant, right? Let me introduce one idea here that I'm not necessarily advocating. I'm just introducing the possibility here that look, given the divergence between where U.S. policy on Russia is substantively and the tough approach that this administration as a whole has taken, some of those decisions have made by Trump, or he's had to allow others to make those decisions, just as a matter of fact. The disparity between that and, again, these tweets or this reference that we often hear where he's saying, wouldn't it be great if we had a great relationship? I'd love to have a good relationship with Putin. It could be that he's playing Putin. It could be. I'm not saying that is necessarily the case. I'm not saying I necessarily believe that. I'm just saying that it is one possibility that we could and should realistically entertain.
David.
Uh-oh.
David Kramer is as someone who signed the 2 letters in 2016, and as someone who recently had to register to vote in Miami after living in Washington for 24 years and leaving the Republican Party to become an independent, let me say that I think one thing we haven't talked about enough is the president's behavior and rhetoric, which is boorish, bullying, divisive, even racist, vulgar. His attacks on journalists, his attacks on institutions, his undermining of institutions has an impact on foreign policy. We are no longer, and maybe we haven't been for a while, but we are no longer the shining city on the hill. And I think it is impossible to separate what he says and does. He is the most powerful person in the world from U.S. foreign policy overall.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that? David, it's generous of you to say that, and it's been something that all of us have been tiptoeing around here. That's true. But I would also say, as a European to you, there but for the grace of God go we. And I shudder to think of a German version of this, and I think we're seeing several European variants of it already in different forms, both on the right and on the left. And I think in this sense, we are truly all in the same boat. We need to look to our own backyards, to our own polities, and repair what's wrong there, and at the same time hold out a hand to each other. But that seems to be, in the current dispensation, an incredibly difficult thing to do because all of us feel so drained by the disruptiveness of this time.
So I think that's an important and powerful note to turn to the closing statements from each of our excellent debaters. I want to thank both teams, and in the interest of the fact that I feel that you have both more than discharged your duty, I don't think it's fair to subject you to an audience vote, because the test of your success this evening is not whether you have necessarily converted anyone to Team Trump, but the real thoughtfulness and seriousness with which both sides have made this discussion such an engaging and important one tonight. So I want to thank everybody for really a terrific conversation this evening.
Thank you.
So in the interest of dinner, and by the way, what a fantastic crowd, considering that we are keeping you from your dinner, we are going to have very quick 1-minute final statements from each of our group, ending on a constructive note. What is one thing that you would have us do or President Trump do to change any of the things we've been commenting on this evening? And Castana, I think we'll go in reverse order here. So you.
I'm sorry. I'm slightly drained by this, but which is, of course, a terrible answer. I think, honestly, the constructive thing for the Europeans to do is to tend to their own failings, to their own weaknesses, and to turn themselves into better partners of a rational America, to the extent that we have that rational America, and it does exist on many levels, and work with the rest of the phenomenon as best we can, including having to resist from time to time. That's the best
Meri?
I can do.
Yes, I think the key word here is solidarity. I think we did pretty well in 2014 after the events in Ukraine. Transatlantic solidarity, but not only. All democracies in the world actually voted sanctions one way or another against Russia. Solidarity is still there. This is very positive, and even Trump changed his mind and decided to be tough, as you said. One quick comment on tough. I don't think it's the right quality for a policy is to be tough with Putin. It needs to be effective. Because if you're tough and you don't get anything out of being tough, we can't afford in Europe, it's just next door, just to be tough. Why? Because of the in-between countries. The countries that are stuck between Putin's Russia and Europe, NATO. We need to address the security and the future of those countries. And I think Europe, not only, of course, has to deal with its own domestic problems in each country and problem of multilateral governance, but it still has to keep its doors open and think about the two neighborhoods that I mentioned earlier, south and east. So solidarity and anticipation. Please prepare for the next period in US policy, as we are in Europe constantly preparing for the next crisis.
Thank you, Meri. Daniel.
Well, let me continue to push the envelope a little bit. And going off what was just said, and I know there's some disagreement on this, rightly so, but I truly believe that Trump is a fleeting phenomenon, and that the United States is never again going to have a president like Donald Trump. The next president's going to be conventional, Republican or Democrat. He or she's going to be like every other president before him or her. And I would note, by the way, that all of those presidents have failed to solve issues like North Korea, like Iran, like the dangerous trade imbalance and IP theft of China. And the list goes on in terms of the challenges that continue to plague us, one administration after another. So my recommendation is to all of us in Europe and in the United States, in the expert community, in the policymaking community, let's give Trump a chance. Let's even go a bit further than that and give his administration and give him the support that's actually going to increase the likelihood that he's going to be successful in some areas and where he might actually solve some of the challenges that none of his predecessors could.
My first professional trip abroad in 1987 was to Germany with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And it made a deep impression on me, and I still continue to believe that far more unites the United States and Europe than divides us, Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party notwithstanding. And my recommendation is simple: have an interagency process, a true process on trade, and give Secretaries Trump and Mattis a seat at the table.
All right. Thank you to all of our debaters, and thank you to you. Bravo.